So as we kick off, first question is, we'd like to know more about you, Mitch. Who are you besides the business part? Because we heard a bit about that already. But who is Mitch Barns?
Well, I'm a husband, and I have been for 33 years. My wife would say 25 good years out of the 33.
That's a good ratio.
Yeah, pretty good, pretty good. But a happily married and devoted husband to my wife, Sharon. We have 3 children. They're all in their 20s, 29, 26, and 24. And all of them are working in different parts of the country, 2 in Chicago, 1 in New York City. I'm a devoted Christ follower, and I am from the United States, originally from the city of Cincinnati. But I've lived outside the U.S. Several times in my life. I lived in Brussels, Belgium for about 5 years, and I also lived in Shanghai in China for almost 4 years. So that's a little bit about me.
Recent in China, or?
And from no, not too recently, not too recently. Yeah, 2008 to 2011.
Okay.
I'm safe.
Sorry, I couldn't help it. Okay, and maybe, for me, when I saw your profile, I guess the first question for me was, you're a guy who managed 40,000 people. Mm-hmm. So obviously, many of us here are managers, and we're wondering, how do you end up doing something like that? So how did you get to top management? What was the story, the plan, the strategy? How did you get there?
Well, it was never something that I set my sights on. It was never really my goal, frankly, to become the CEO of such a big company. And I think that was one of the keys to the fact that I did become the CEO of the company. It was because I was always focused on what I'll call intrinsic things as opposed to fundamental or transactional things. What I mean is I was always saying to myself, I want to do things that are challenging and yet are a good fit with my skills and interests. I want to always be learning, and I want to work in an environment that has values that align with mine. And as long as I'm doing that, whatever that leads to, I'll be okay with that. Mm-hmm. And that was the path that I followed in my career almost, not at the very start. In fact, the fact that Don Lothrop is here is really interesting because for the first several years of my career, first 3 or 4 or 5 years of my career, that's not the way I thought. I was very goal-driven. I wanted to be the head of the organization. I wanted to be, the CEO maybe someday. And then one day, it was Don Lothrop's dad started asking me some questions. Don's dad used to be the head of HR at P&G in the U.S., and he started asking me some questions about my career and how I was approaching things. And he gave me some advice. He said, instead of being so goal-driven, why don't you just set your sights on what's important to you, what you find valuable, what you find energizing, maybe even what you just find beautiful in your work and in your interactions with people, and just focus on that and trust that that will lead you to really good things. And so it was around age 27 when I made that switch in terms of how I approach things, and I think it had everything to do with where I ended up. Well, not everything. It had a lot to do with where I ended up. I would add 2 more things that probably were crucial to me eventually becoming the CEO of a big company. So the first one was that approach. The second thing is I also just said yes all the time. What I mean by that is, somebody would be talking to the group and they would say, we need somebody to, and even before they would finish the sentence, I would just say, I'll do it. Even before I knew what the task was, I just wanted to always be involved in the new thing. Because I knew it would probably be more interesting. I would learn more. I was never really afraid to take a risk and to fail. So I think that helped a lot as well. I got involved in some really interesting things really early in my career that accelerated my development and compensated for my otherwise fairly mediocre education and credentials in my career. So that's the second thing. And the third thing that I have to also give a lot of credit to is just the role of pure, dumb, random luck. We were talking about it as we were walking over here this evening, and I think this is something that many people are either not fully aware of, just how big a role luck plays in our individual success, or even if we are aware of it, we really don't want to admit it, right? But the facts show, if you look at academic studies or a lot of really interesting books on this topic, shows that luck plays a much bigger role than a lot of people are aware or a lot of people are willing to admit. And I'm willing to admit it now. Mm-hmm. And I'm convinced that it did play a big role for me too. Just the pure serendipity of being at a particular place at a particular time and choosing to say A instead of B, and that turning out to be a good thing instead of a bad thing, mm-hmm. even though you had no idea before you said it whether or not it was going to work. And a very tangible example of that was back in 2006, the company I was working with, Nielsen, was acquired by a consortium of private equity companies. They hired in a new CEO. In fact, they changed the entire management team. And right after the new CEO came in, I had a chance to sit down with him and talk with him and get to know him. Before the meeting, I had already decided that I was going to leave the company because getting bought by a consortium of private equity companies, this does not sound like a very good thing to me, right? They were going to take a bunch of cost out. It was going to be a tough few years ahead, so I thought, I'm going to move on and do something else at some other company. So I sit down with the new CEO, and because I had already decided I'm going to leave, I was very free to say whatever I wanted. I had nothing to lose because I was already going to leave. And it just so turned out that that was exactly the kind of person that he likes. Somebody who speaks freely, comes across as very confident. I was not intimidated by him. He's a very intimidating guy. I was not afraid of him, and a lot of people were afraid of him. And so I stood out relative to everybody else who he had those early encounters with, and he decided very early on that he liked me, and he convinced me to stay, and he convinced me that he was going to develop me to be his successor, which turned out to be true several years later, but turned out to be true. By the way, that same guy just was named the new CEO of Boeing right in the middle of the Boeing crisis. So he's the new CEO of Boeing right now. But that's pure luck. The fact that I had already decided to leave made me speak freely to him, and then he happened to be somebody who liked that rather than was irritated by it, mm-hmm. and he decided very quickly that I was going to be his successor. So, how do you make that up?
Yeah, thank you. And by the way, because as you speak, so many side questions pop up in my mind. So, and I'm sure the same happens for everybody here. So. Just know that there will be a time for questions from the audience that you can ask and also vote for in an application, and we'll put that up. It's already up there. So if you have any interesting questions based on some remarks, there will be time for that. But just a side question which I thought of, when you said you started doing what you were interested in, does it mean that it's going to be easy? Because many people think, if you do what you love, that should be easy all the time. So how do you look at that?
Well, usually for me, the things I'm interested in aren't the easy things. Mm-hmm. I just am the kind of person who tends to be drawn to a challenge, a new learning opportunity. I consider an ideal role one that I'm not qualified for, and that I have to work really hard and as fast as I can to become qualified for the role that I've already been given. Mm-hmm. That to me is what's interesting. And so maybe it's that twist on what I see as interesting that was helpful to me.
Okay, thank you. And another question also about Nielsen. What is it like to run a company of 40,000 people? I mean, our companies here are by far much smaller, even though we might belong to some bigger company or bigger group. Yeah. And what does it look like? What does it feel like?
Well, the one thing I realized early on is when you're named the CEO of a big company, $6.5 billion in revenue, 106 countries of operations, 45,000 employees, the day you're named CEO, suddenly your jokes are funnier. Just think about that for a second.
Well, I can say, even with the smaller size, it still happens,
It still happens, yeah. But that's one of the traps, I think, of being named to a position of influence and leadership is people start to treat you differently. And in some ways, that's a danger, and in some ways, that's a huge, huge opportunity. And I think the biggest thing that I had to learn my way through early on was to avoid the dangerous part of that. Part of the danger is you don't get people to tell you the truth, the things you really need to know enough, and so you have to go more proactively seek that out, draw people close to you who are willing to tell you the things that you need to know that aren't necessarily so positive. So That's one thing that I had to counter. But the other thing is the opportunity side of it. It is such a huge platform so that the messages you decide to communicate, the way you decide to communicate them, the posture, the attitude, the values you try to convey is a tremendous opportunity to not only influence a company, but to influence the individual people inside that company and the way they think about their role in relation to that company, and also the way that they feel about themselves when they go home and interact with their families, with their friends, with their communities. And so what I always wanted to do was convince people that they should be leveraging the environment of the company as a platform to help them not only be successful in their work, but to also enrich every other aspect of their life. And when you do that, it suddenly becomes a relationship. They have a sense of membership in the company, and it's a completely different equation. So that to me is what this kind of an opportunity is about. Yeah, it has a lot of dangers and risks and downsides and pressures, but it also is this tremendous opportunity, and that's what I really tried to focus on as much as I possibly could while I was in that role, was how can I make the most of that opportunity to create this environment for everybody who is a part of it, to make it the richest and most positive experience for them that I possibly could.
Great, thank you. Okay, I want to move a bit to the topic of tonight, which is about how to create a healthy organizational culture. And especially when you run a large company, I guess it's much more challenging than when you do in a smaller unit. So what would you say would be the basic ingredients of an organizational culture, and how do you go about it? I mean, once you decide that you want to have some components in place, what do you do about it?
Well, this word culture is, for me, always been a bit challenging. I think early in my career, I never really gave a lot of thought to the idea of culture. I always thought it was all the soft stuff that nobody could really explain or quantify the importance of, and so it got lumped into a category of culture, and it turned into ping pong tables and nice food in the cafe and stuff like that. So I always discounted the importance of culture. And then it was about maybe 10 or 15 years ago, I heard a professor from Stanford, a graduate school of business named Charles O'Reilly, talk about culture, and he talked about it in a very different way than how I'd heard described up to that point in time. What he said was, I'm going to set culture aside for a second. I'm going to just talk about the idea of governance. What he meant was every business or every organization has to be governed. It has to have a certain set of controls or rules or policies. It has to be directed in some way, shape, or form. And there's no way around it. It has to be governed. And then he said, and there are two sources of that governance that's required. And those two sources have to add up to be 100% of the governance necessary for that organization to function well. Those two sources of governance, one is rules and policies and controls. In other words, all the stuff that nobody likes. Bureaucracy, in essence. But some of it's necessary. The other source of governance is what he called social norms. And as he explained what he meant by social norms, I quickly realized, oh, that's culture. That's what he means by culture. And then he ultimately said, yeah, that's culture. So those are the two sources of governance. Then what he said, the stronger an organization's culture is, the less they have to rely on rules and policies and controls, all the stuff people don't like. But the weaker your culture is, the more you have to rely on rules and policies and controls, because again, you have to have 100% of the governance required for the organization to function. And when he described it this way, suddenly the light went on for me. That's why I should be in love with culture. That's why I should invest in trying to make the culture as strong as it can be and as positive as it can be. And that's when I became a devoted follower of building the strongest culture that I could as a leader. So then, I guess the next step I got to in my thinking, in my learning around culture, was realizing that culture is one of those things that's built very, very slowly, in most cases, often through call it hundreds or maybe even thousands of individual actions, decisions, words, interactions that you have with individual people in the organization every single day. In other words, culture is usually built, if it's a strong one, brick by brick, step by step, word by word. So that also said, okay, I can never take a day off with regard to culture. Every single day, the culture of this organization is either going to get stronger or weaker. And I need not only for myself to be investing in this culture, but every member of our leadership team. And so I've got to get them on board as well. And then lastly, I think the key thing about culture that I came to realize was, it's mostly conveyed through the values and the actions that you take as a leader, as a leadership team. And that those things ultimately are sending signals every time you take an action or make a decision or make an announcement. And the culture, what you want in a culture is always way more clear to you as the leader than it is to the individual people in the organization. So you not only have to communicate it, and communicate it as clearly as you can, and as regularly as you can, you actually have to over-communicate it to the point where you're almost sick of hearing yourself talk about the things that you think are important to your culture. That's about the right place to get to as a leader. That's when other people are probably starting to register with those points about where you need them to be. And then the final key to culture is not only say the right words and take the right actions, but do everything you can as the leader and as the leadership team to reinforce the culture that you want through the different people systems that you might have in place. The way you reward people, the way you announce changes or movements or promotions within the organization, the way you select leaders for open positions. One thing I learned as a leader, in part because I got it wrong once or twice, is I was trying to build a certain kind of a culture, and then out of expediency, in one or two occasions, I would pick somebody for a key leadership role who the rest of the organization saw as very much contrary to that culture that I was talking about all the time. And so I would have moved 50 meters ahead, and then with one leadership decision, I would erase all 50 meters of that progress by just making the wrong selection of the leader. And so I learned that lesson very painfully as well. So those are some of the thoughts I have on culture.
Great. And maybe just to make it even more real, could you give an example of some of the values that you try to instill in the organization when you define a good, healthy culture?
One was that I was always looking for people who, of course, were going to do their assigned role very, very well. That there's a lot of accountability. I think it's important in high-performing organizations that individuals have to be accountable for the role that they've been assigned to play in the organization. But the kind of culture I wanted was people who were not satisfied with doing just their job well. I wanted people who said, I'm going to do my job well, and I'm going to be just as concerned about helping my colleague to my left, my colleague to my right, being successful in their role as well. Yeah, you can talk about teamwork, but that's a slightly different version of teamwork where you're as vested not only in your own personal success, but also the success of the other key people around you. And if you're doing that, and if they're doing that, it builds this self-reinforcing interdependency, and it creates this team environment that if any of you have ever been a part of something like that, you know exactly what I'm talking about, right? It's a really difficult thing to do, but when you get it right, it is incredible how powerful it can be. Best team I ever worked with was the team of people that I was working with when I was based in China. If you looked at each of the people on the leadership team, about 18 people, individually, none of them were really spectacular. I hate to say that publicly because maybe one of them will hear me say this now.
We'll put this up online.
Yeah, all right, good. But none of us were really special. We were all fairly average, frankly. But that team was way above average because they totally bought into this idea of I'm going to do my job well, and I'm also going to help everybody else in this team who I possibly can make a contribution to be successful too. And it just creates this self-reinforcing sense of energy and momentum and strength that you can never get when everybody is simply looking out for themselves. I mean, to get people to subordinate their self-interest at least a little bit and instead put the interests of the team above themselves. It's a very Christian idea, by the way, but it's also a fantastic business idea. That is a very powerful leadership concept, leadership team concept.
Okay, thank you. Following up on culture, I heard a leader say once that if you need to change somebody, you need to change somebody. And what he meant was, if you ever need to change a person in your team in terms of behavior, then you'd rather fire him, because you don't need to invest in people. Just, either they are the right person or they're not, and then you just have to move on. So I'm just curious on your perspective regarding, how much is a leader's role or responsibility in helping somebody change, and at what point you draw the line and you say, I cannot change the person, so I need to replace the person with somebody else.
Yeah, I've heard that expression many times. If you can't change the people, change the people. And but I've also heard another expression right alongside that one, which is anybody can fire somebody. That's actually the easy way out. Often it's the lazy way out. And so I've taken both of those somewhat contradictory ideas, and I've held on to them both. Because I think it is right. If you can't change the people, then you do need to change the people. But it should almost be your last resort to fire somebody. The idea that I have is you can almost always do better. If somebody's not performing well in a role, you can always do better by trying to find a better fit for that person, or trying to understand why they're not performing well. Maybe it's a lack of clarity, maybe it's a lack of feedback. Sometimes it's my fault, not that person's fault. I need to try everything I possibly can to try to improve that person's performance before I simply reject them from the organization. And I've found, in my career that when I really do focus on that you can often get people to perform a lot better, and you don't need to fire them. And at the same time, if I'm being very clear, very direct with the person about what is expected of them, and holding them to very high standards, often they get removed from the organization, but not by me. They remove themselves. They realize, this person knows exactly what he wants from me. I'm simply not able to deliver it. This is not where I should be in order for me to be performing at my best. I'm not the right fit for what this organization needs. And many times in my leadership experience, people take themselves out of the equation rather than me having to take them out of the equation. The only time I really feel compelled to simply fire somebody right away is if they have an integrity violation. And it comes down, almost all things do, right, to lying, cheating, and stealing. And there are many clever ways that people will lie or cheat or steal from you. Sometimes it's so subtle that you don't even know that one of those labels is in fact the right label. But it's happening all the time. I'm very sober about the reality that, if I have a leadership team of 20 people, almost always at least one of them is either lying or cheating or stealing from me, probably on any given day. I just don't know which one it is, right? And I never take it personally. And by the way, when you're leading a 100-person organization, the sheer probability says there's one or two. When you're leading a company of 40,000 people, there's hundreds of them. And you just can't take it personally. But it's happening. And then when you do find it, I think it's essential in that particular situation that you exit the person, and you do it with grace and care, and you're not trying to reject them from the planet. That's usually not necessary to do it that way, but you do want to exit them from the team. And it sends an important message to the rest of the organization that their care and concern for doing things the right way is in fact worth it. When you allow somebody to get away with not doing things the right way, you're almost begging the rest of the organization to not take on the burden of doing things the right way.
Okay. If I look in the audience, I would say that maybe the average age is like 30, around 30. Now we're tilting it in the wrong direction, but so let's assume you're 30 again. And what advice would you give to your own 30-year-old self at that point in career?
Well, I did get that great advice from Don Lothrop's father, Jim Lothrop, when I was 27, and I think I would just reinforce that same advice. You know, stay intrinsically motivated, stay true to your values, always be learning. Always be somebody who is willing to look in the mirror and ask yourself the hard questions, the honest questions about whether you're operating in a sustainable manner, doing things the right way. If your grandchildren say, hey, Grandpa, someday, if your grandchildren say to you, hey, Grandpa, what was your life all about? That you'll have an answer that you'll be excited to share with them, right? And I think that's the great advice I got early in my life. And so it's not a natural act, really. I think the rest of the world doesn't naturally encourage you to orient yourself and live your life on that basis. So the advice I would want to get when I'm 30 is the same advice that I probably need to remind myself of every single year of my life to try to stay, true to that set of ideas and stay on that path rather than think about things the way the rest of the world will generally pull me and encourage me to do it.
That's very nice. Actually, as you were saying it, I just remembered Harvard professor Clayton Christensen just passed away last week. And actually, one of the big points that he made was that in life you should be more concerned about how you live and less about what you achieve, because eventually that's going to define your life much more at the end, and you'll be much more happy about how you've done things, not necessarily what you've done.
Yeah.
And
he has that terrific book he wrote a few years ago. And what is the title of that book? Does anybody know? How will
you measure your life?
How will you measure your life? Yeah, it's a fantastic book.
And for those of us who don't feel we have so much time, there's a TED Talk on that.
Oh, perfect.
I think it's one of the most viewed TED Talks ever. So for anybody interested, I think it's a great resource. Because actually he was telling the story of Harvard grads coming back after 20, 30 years, and the fact that, they were very successful professionally, but looking at their personal life, they were pretty, challenged, let's say. And he just figured it out that, it matters much more, who you live your life with than what you achieve, in a sense. And that matters so much more in time.
Yeah.
Okay. Looking at your resume, I was happy to see that you've stayed on with the same company for many years. Actually, how many years did you stay with Nielsen for?
22.
22 years. Actually, I'm around 23 with the same company right now, which is quite unusual in Romania and even less usual in IT. And I just wanted to ask you, as a subjective question, what are the pros and cons of staying with the same company for a long time?
Well, with Nielsen, 22 years. But over that 22 years, I had 11 different positions. I lived in 6 different cities, 3 different continents. So on the one hand, one company for 22 years. On the other hand, a lot of different environments, different kinds of businesses, different places in the world. So I had a little bit of a nice mix. I think the positives that I experienced from being at the same company for so long was you just continue to build this community of colleagues and friends and experiences, and they're all attached to the same brand. That whole long tenure, that whole long career that I had with Nielsen. And start to get to a point where you just kind of, at least I did, fall in love with the company and everything that the company represents. But mostly, if you're falling in love with the company, what are you really falling in love with? Because the company is nothing. A company's just people. And so you're falling in love with people and the experiences and the memories that you've accumulated with those people, all the things you've learned, all the things that you experienced together. And so it's just a very rich experience. Also, to be able to go through several planning cycles, all in the same company. What I mean is you set out a plan, you then execute on that plan for a few years, and you then see the consequences of your decisions. And then you get to reload and take another run at it. And then a few years later, you reload again and take another run at it. And that learning cycle is so powerful. If you're always leaving a company, after 2 or 3 years, you're leaving really before you have to fully live with the consequences of your decisions from a few years prior. It has other positives associated with it, but it won't be quite the same learning experience, I think, as if you're staying with the same company. I think the biggest downside with staying with Nielsen for 22 years, though, or any company for a long time, is you can miss out on some vitality. One of the things I enjoyed about Nielsen is moving to all these different roles, but it probably could even be a richer and more, higher vitality experience if I were not just moving to different roles in the same company, but actually experiencing different corporate environments and different industries, more so than staying within Nielsen allowed me to by itself. So like everything else in life, there's trade-offs, positives and negatives, and so you simply try to, with whatever your circumstances are, make the most of the good things and to do everything you can to minimize the negative impacts of the downsides.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Well, one of my last questions, and then we'll go into audience-related questions. You started your speech by mentioning that moment when you were mentored. And, I think we all know that having a mentor is very important. And my question is, how do you find a good mentor? How do you go about it?
Well, I'm a believer that we're all being mentored all the time, by the people around us. It's just that they're not all good mentors. Sometimes the signals that are being sent to us by the people around us are, in fact, not the right signals. They may even be negative signals. They may be the wrong signals. So the idea of being very intentional about who you stew your attention to, and then who do you start to build a relationship with to make the most out of that mentoring relationship and minimizing the influence of some of the not so positive mentoring relationships around you, I think it's one of the most important things we can do in order to grow in our leadership. So how did I do it? Well, part of it is simply being open and available, being willing to show yourself in a somewhat vulnerable mode by saying to people around you, people that you think would make a good mentor, some of the things that are on your mind, some of the things that you're not so sure about, some of the things that concern you, or where you're seeking answers to questions that you really haven't been able to address yourself. Then what I find is if you're doing that and directing some of those thoughts, some of those words to people around you that you think could be a good source of mentorship, people will self-select. Some people will be interested in that opportunity to share some thoughts with you, and some of them won't. And then when somebody does reciprocate, then just build that relationship. Build that relationship and be as open as you can. And if you try enough, it's a numbers game. At some point, you'll just start to strike gold, and those mentoring relationships will be extremely valuable to you. That's the key for me.
Great. Well, if I look at the questions, there are a few, but the top two are actually very related. So I'm going to combine the top two questions because the first one is, what's your purpose in life? And the second one is, what drives you? And I guess they are related, so quite curious on your perspective, what's your purpose in life and what drives you? What makes you tick?
My purpose in life? Wow, that's a big question. Yeah. I'm always trying to figure it out. I know that I'm very driven to just make a contribution. I feel like all of us have certain gifts, certain interests. We've had some good fortune in our lives, so find a way then to take that in and then to push it back out in a way that is useful to somebody, some team, some organization, or even to society as a whole. It's as simple as that, especially at this stage of my life where I've kind of moved through the bulk of my working career and the accumulation phase of life, and now I'm really focused on just trying to, spend my time in a way that's significant and useful and of service to other people. So I don't know if that's a very good answer in terms of what my purpose in life is. I think maybe the one other thought to add is it's something that, again, as a devoted follower of Christ, I ask myself in my prayer all the time with God, to show me where I should be and how I should be and how I should be allocating my time, my energy, in order to best align with the will that God has for me in the world. And never really clear answer on that, but I think it is always the right question if you're a follower of Christ to try to ask yourself that question.
And what drives you?
Well, I like being uncomfortable. I like to learn new things. One of the things that I've discovered throughout the course of my career and the course of my life is usually that some of the best things that have happened to me in my life were not, they really weren't good things at the time they were happening, but they've only turned out to be really good things in retrospect. So I now have developed this sort of twisted way of thinking about the world where, I almost look forward to the next bad thing that's going to happen to me. Because I know it'll probably be a source of great growth and learning, and it'll set me on a new path that'll probably be better than any path I would have been able to choose for myself. And so that's a strange way, I know, to approach life and to live your life, but because of events earlier in my life, that's the way I've been tuned now. There's a saying, in fact, that captures this idea really well. It's one of my favorite quotes. It's from many years ago. There was the second president of the United States was John Adams. His son was John Quincy Adams, and they were going to sail across the Atlantic Ocean from America to France. And the mother of the young son wrote a letter to her son. And back then, if you're going across the ocean, a lot of bad things can happen. Maybe pirates, might be disease, it might be storm. You don't know that you're really going to make it. So Abigail Adams writes this letter to her 12-year-old son, John Quincy. And the letter includes a passage that goes something like this, which I think is one of the most beautiful things that I've ever read, and it captures this idea about, approaching life, looking forward to even the bad things that might come. Her letter said something like this. She said, "There are times in life in which genius would wish to live. It's not in the still calm of life or the repose of a Pacific station that great characters are formed. The habits of a vigorous mind are formed by contending with difficulties. Great necessities call out great virtues. When a mind is raised and animated by scenes that engage the heart, then those qualities that would otherwise lay dormant wake into life and they form the character." That was what she wrote to her 12-year-old son. And there is so much wisdom just packed into that beautiful little, set of statements. And if I would have read that when I was 12 years old, I would have said, "No way, Mom. That doesn't sound like a good idea." But through the different events that have happened throughout my life, I've learned just how true that really is. And I've also learned that how grateful I am that I haven't been shielded from all of those challenges and difficulties, frankly, suffering that occasionally we encounter in our life. I only look back at some of those things and realize how grateful I should be, and I think how grateful I really am now to have been able to experience some of those things, which again were very unpleasant at the time that they happened. But I became a completely different person. I think a better person, a better contributor to this world because of those bad things. And that's why, if it makes a little more sense now, I can even say that I might even look forward to the next bad thing that might happen.
Well, I think that's really powerful. And especially for us as Romanians who are stuck in a long transition for the last 30 years, and there was another long transition in the 50 years before. And I think we have a lot to be thankful for, but it hasn't been easy always. So that makes a lot of sense. Thank you. We have some very pragmatic questions now from people, so I want to continue with that. Please describe some ways to motivate employees, except money, if you don't have funds allocated for that.
Well, I think the big concept in corporate world as far as motivating people these days is this idea of engagement. And I've tried to think my way. Everybody familiar with this word, engagement, employee engagement? The Gallup organization will talk a lot about engagement. I've tried to think my way through it, and here's some of the ways that I've thought my way through it. First, I start with the idea of strategy. Strategy gets a lot of talk in business schools. Strategy gets a lot of talk in the business world, in the corporate world. I'm a little bit of a skeptic, frankly, on when it comes to strategy. I think strategy is overblown, gets too much credit for being super important. Why? Not because I don't think strategy is important, but because I've learned through my business experience that the strategy is only as good as your ability to execute. Strategy is only as good as your ability to execute. So you can make this fantastic strategy in a PowerPoint presentation, but if you can't execute that, if your team can't execute that, that strategy is worth nothing. Absolutely nothing. It really comes down to execution. Now, what's the key to execution? Well, it's having people in the organization who are fully engaged, crystal clear about what it is that they're supposed to do, how their role in that team or in that organization contributes to that bigger picture. So I think that's where you can start with the idea of strategy, realize execution is really the key to making strategy valuable, and then seeing how important employee engagement really is. And you've approached it from that way. Now you can just keep going through the chain. When people are crystal clear about how their individual role fits into the bigger picture, what they do is they feel like they have a name in that organization. They feel like they're important to that organization because they understand how their actions that they take today are going to contribute to results that are going to be seen tomorrow. And they're able to make decisions for themselves even when nobody is around to tell them what to do. Because, they see how their contribution fits into this bigger picture, and they have some value judgments that they can make. That's what most people, in my experience, really want. They want to be known. They want to be assured that their role in the organization is important, it's relevant, and they want to be accountable. They want to be measured. They want to be able to see for themselves the contribution to the bigger picture that they've been able to make over time. I think when you have that, even if you don't have more money, you've given people a lot of what everybody really wants, and that almost nobody has in perfect 100% form at any given time. You saw from the results that were up on the screen earlier that Ruben showed how I think on the second question, one of the biggest answers was, I don't know how I fit relative to the organization's purpose. Well, nobody should be able to go home and say that. Really. Everybody should know within an organization how the role that they've been asked to fulfill somehow contributes to the overall purpose of the organization. So if a lot of people say that they don't know how their role fits in to the overall purpose of the organization, they either don't know what the purpose of the organization is, or they just don't understand what the linkage of their role is to that purpose. That is fixable. That's one of the things that I think everybody should be excited about. Is one of the biggest ways to motivate employees is free, and it's fairly easy if you just give it some really devoted and focused attention as a leader. And we see a lot of companies around the world who have fantastic strategies and maybe don't really have fantastic results. And then you see other companies that have strategies that are fairly similar to everybody else's and have world-beating results. And nobody can really tell very easily from the outside why you see these kinds of patterns emerge. And almost always, once you get inside the organization, it's this kind of alignment between people's role in the organization and the overall purpose of the organization. And that engagement drives the execution, which makes the strategy seem like genius, really.
Thanks. Actually, I think you've answered a question which hasn't been even asked to you yet. But I'll ask it anyhow, and you might want to add to that. So what are the keys to develop an organizational culture in a small business? And I think they mean a healthy one. So when you have a small business, because you have your background in a huge business, how do you go about creating this healthy org culture in a small business?
Well, I was CEO of a big company, but before that I was the head of much smaller business units, and And I think, in fact, I had a lot more fun when I did that versus when I was a CEO of a big company. Didn't get paid as much, but that's life. But how to build that culture? Well, I think in many respects it's easier because it can be a lot more personal. You can have a lot more personal and direct interactions with people on the front lines. I'm always a big believer in any team or any organization in this concept of finding the right balance between the center of the organization, or you can also say the top of the organization, and what I'll call the edge. So if you think of an org chart, it would be the first couple of levels. You can think of that as the edge. I like to think of an organization more as a constellation, and you'll have the senior leaders in the middle, and then out at the edge, that's the part of the organization that's closest to the market, closest to the clients, closest to the actions that need to be taken, closest to where the action is. So how do you balance the center with the edge? Especially, how do you balance the power that's allocated within the organization and the ability to make decisions in the organization? So in a smaller organization, I think it's easier just with fingertip feel as a leader to find that right balance. Mm-hmm. And when you do, you can really do some great things. In a much bigger organization, it's really difficult to know where that balance point should be and even know where it happens to be at any given point in time. But by knowing people out at the edge, spending time with people on the front lines, first of all, you're going to build that connection as the leader. But second of all, you're going to learn a lot of things from them that otherwise you may not be able to know. And that will be the key to building the kind of culture that you want.
Mm-hmm. Actually, there's another related question, and that is, you said culture plus procedures equals 100%. And in a small startup, culture is 100% because you don't have procedures.
Right.
So what's the mix at Nielsen, and what is the ideal mix between culture and procedures?
Well, the mix at Nielsen at a total company level, mm-hmm. Well, we were too bureaucratic. We had a lot of rules and controls and policies, and so we were always trying to fight those down and beat those down, reduce the bureaucracy. And the key to it was not to just try to reduce rules and controls, but the key was really just to build the culture mm-hmm. to be more positive and stronger. And then you'll naturally find that right balance. I don't know if I can really quantify it, but it was probably, I might be generous to Nielsen in saying this, but maybe 3/4 rules and controls, 25% social norms, but heading in the right direction.
Okay.
Heading in the right direction.
Okay. And also on culture, can the culture of an organization be changed, and how difficult is that, to change the culture?
Well, yeah, it can be changed, but it is difficult, and I think that's a good news and a bad news. If culture can be changed, really easily, then it may not be the best thing to invest in, because mm-hmm. that means it's not very durable, not very sustainable to different events that might happen. My experience also is culture tends to change very slowly, unless there's some really cataclysmic, catastrophic event that can have a big effect on culture, but it tends to move at more of a glacial pace in my experience.
Okay. What are the top KPIs you use to measure the health of an organization?
We had a system for employee engagement that we used at Nielsen that was based on the Gallup system. And they have a system that they've used with thousands of companies over a couple of decades. And it had 8 key dimensions. Mm-hmm. And some of the dimensions were very clear about, I understand how my role fits in with the purpose of the organization. So that's a fairly expected type of question that they would ask in their system. Actually, there were 12 questions in the Gallup system. That was one. Another question in their system was, I have a best friend at work. I thought that's a really weird question to have in an employee survey, but they were convinced that it was a really important question to ask. So there's a whole battery, a whole variety of questions that they would ask. Then they would compare those results to a database, and they would show you how they would show us how we would compare to other companies of a similar size, of a similar type, and then we would build action plans to try to address some mm-hmm. of those things. That's the way we addressed it at Nielsen.
Okay. I saw a more personal question, and that is, how are you able to disconnect your thoughts about work when getting back home? So how do you disconnect?
Is this a work-life balance question? Is that what that is?
I guess so.
So I'll come back to the specific question, but maybe just to talk for a second about this idea of work-life balance. I've been asked questions about this a lot. I also have spoken a lot about it at Nielsen in the leadership development programs that the company has. And first of all, I think when you can find leaders who can have success in their career and do it in the context of a balanced life, to me, that's one of the most inspiring things that I can see. I love, to learn about, get to know people who are able to demonstrate that kind of quality in their life. So that would be number one point I would want to make. Second is, I think what I've learned in my career is to achieve some balance, a sustainable pace. I used to take all the advice about time management, right? Probably some of you maybe even taken a time management course. The old time management, classic time management said, you make your task list, you assign priorities. A priorities are the most important. C priorities, those are the least important. So you have to code everything on your list. You start with the A's, and if you don't have time for the C's, that's life. And that's the way you manage your time, and that's the way you achieve balance in life. What I learned is that just doesn't work very well. That managing your time is actually kind of a waste of time, right? Instead, for me at least, and I think for many people I've gotten to know well over my career, managing your energy is a way better idea than managing your time. In fact, managing your energy might say, you make that same task list, you can still code them, the A's are most important, the C's are the least important. Maybe the best choice for you to make is to do a C first. Why? Not because it's the most important thing, just simply because it gives you joy. It's something that's fun. It energizes you. And it fires you up, gives you the energy you need to go tackle one of those ugly A priorities. Those things you really don't want to do. It's going to suck all the life out of you, but you know you need to do it. That's part of your job as a leader. When you're a leader, you sign up not for the good parts of the job, you got to sign up for the whole job, good and the bad parts. And sometimes you need to reward yourself with a C priority because it's fun. And by doing it, you have enough of that energy to do the A's. Managing your energy is a way better idea, in my experience, than managing your time. The last thing I'll say on this balance, work-life balance issue is I find that people often just completely misunderstand the concept of balance. Here's what I see happen. I'm going to stand up to demonstrate this. So you have the work side of your life, and you have the other side of your life. And what happens is, inevitably the work side gets heavier. It does. Stuff happens, bunch of, pressures come on you. And what do we do? When work side gets heavier, we run over here and we throw ourselves in and try to solve all these problems, don't we? Don't we? And meanwhile, everything that's over here just got a little lighter, right? It gets a little bit less attention. Balance says, don't do that. Balance says, when this side gets heavier, what do you have to do to maintain balance? You have to make this side heavier too, right? That's balance. I know it sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? But work your way through it. When you have to know, what are the things that fill your tank of energy? What are those things? It might be fitness. It might be time with people who matter to you. It might be reading. It might be doing C priority things. It might be your spouse. It might be time alone and quiet and doing nothing. You need to know what those things are. Whatever they are for you personally, you need to know what those things are, and you need to have them always at the ready. Because this other side's coming at you. I promise you it will. And you'll have very little to do, very little to say about how fast and how hard it hits you. And so when this side happens and gets heavier, you need to have available to you these other things to be able to turn to in order to maintain balance in your life. Like for me personally, what gives me energy is time with my wife, reading things that I find intellectually stimulating, and cycling. I'll just name those three things. Cycling, going out riding for 50K, 80K, something like that. So when the work side of my life would get heavier, I would go ride farther and faster, right? When the work side was a little easy, I might even take a week off from cycling. That's balance. That's what balance is. Or when the work side gets heavier, I would protect my time with my wife even more aggressively. Even more aggressively. When the work side of my life would get heavier, I would be even more resistant to allowing myself, allowing access to me by people who otherwise, just were not very energizing to me. I'd be more protective because you don't have the ability to give at that moment in time. That's what balance is all about. And I've talked about this concept a lot. I learned it from a guy named Wayne Cordero at the Global Leadership Summit back in 2007. He's a former pastor, and he burned himself out. He went and checked himself into a convent, and he was supposed to be in this convent for 6 weeks. And in the convent, no digital devices, and he's not allowed to talk for 6 weeks. And after 2 weeks, he couldn't take it, and he escaped the convent. And he went down into the town and got in what do you call, like a internet chat room kind of thing, rented time on a computer and sent emails to all of his friends, and then he snuck back into the convent, and he finished out his 6 weeks. And when he got out of the convent, his wife picked him up, and he told her what he had done, and she said...
So he didn't write her?
What's that?
So when he wrote emails, he didn't send to his wife?
No, he did. But he was telling her the story, and she said, well, Wayne, when you went back to the convent, what happened? And he said, they didn't say a word. It's a convent, yeah. I thought it was pretty funny. Anyway, balance is a really big deal, and to me, managing your energy, not your time, and just remembering that concept of balance. When I've talked about this over the years, it's a lot of faces like this in the room. People look at me like, what in the world is he talking about? But if you think about it a little bit more, here's what's going to happen. A day or two from now, you're going to say, oh, I get it now. Because that's what's happened to me so many times. A few years ago, I was in a dark parking garage in Chicago, and some guy yells across the parking garage to me. To this day, I don't even know who it was. He's, Mitch, Mitch. And I turn around, and it's just the shadow of this human being. He goes, balance, I get it now. That's the way you're going to be, I promise.
Great. And, one of the last questions, how do you manage the success so that it doesn't manage you? I mean, how do you stay sane having the success that you've had?
Well, I think it goes back a little bit to where we began. I was the CEO of this big company, but it was never my goal. I even said to myself out loud, with my wife sitting right there with me, I said, if I become the CEO, that's great, but if I don't, my life's still pretty good. And by the way, if I become CEO, and I'm the CEO for a few years, and then one day I'm not the CEO anymore, my life's still going to be pretty good. In fact, when you're the CEO, there's some good things about it. I'll be honest, there's some really good things about it, and there's some things that aren't very good about it at all. And you all know this. You all have positions of responsibility and leadership, and again, if you sign up for it, the whole package, not just the good parts, which is the way any of us should enter into a leadership role. You gotta take it on in a mindset of service, not in a mindset of I'm now the king or the queen. In other words, they're not there to serve you. You're still there to serve them. Then, there's a lot of burdens and a lot of trade-offs and a lot of things you give up in life if you're really approaching the role and the responsibilities of leadership in the right way. So I think that was always my attitude was, life's good, now life is going to be good when I'm doing that, but I don't have to hold on to it. Mm-hmm. And if you think about it that way, this isn't something that I'm going to work really hard to hold on to. Losing it, or the day that you don't have it anymore, is not the end of the world. Mm-hmm. It's just the next chapter in your life. And that's a very freeing way to live. I just can't tell you how freeing it is. To be able to live every day of your life just saying, this is what I have right now. I'm going to do the very best I can with this opportunity and these responsibilities. And then when those aren't my responsibilities anymore, I'm going to move on to whatever life brings me next. And you're never trying to hold on to something. When you're trying to hold on to something and you feel and fear the loss of it, that's a very different way to live your life, and a much more difficult way, in my view, than this other way, which is I'm a steward and I'm passing through on my way to something, even though I don't know what it is, that will come next.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Well, I'm going to get closer to the close, but before that, I saw a remark here which I take as legit from Don. He said, "No, yeah, it's you. Okay, good. I thought it's somebody posing at you who said, you want to have a comment on Mitch's mentor, which is your dad. Yeah, please."
First off, Mitch, my brother and Mitch are best friends. And he told me 4 years ago, you and Mitch need to meet each other.
Just wait a bit for the mic, because that's going to help a lot with the recording. So if you can repeat that, that would be great once you get the mic.
So Mitch Barns and my brother have been best friends, seen each other every year for 35 years. And he said to me 4 years ago, you and Mitch need to meet each other. And a year and a half ago, Mitch did a podcast that you guys can find or Daniel can share at where he went to undergrad. And he talked about my dad in there. And one of the things, and it's interesting, as I get to know Mitch, he sought out my dad as a mentor.
Yeah.
I tried to run away from him as a mentor. But one of the things you said on your podcast that my dad showed to me is when you're 30, put yourself in a good organization, in a good place. Like you went to Procter & Gamble. I went to KPMG. I went to General Mills. So one of the things that I heard from you on the podcast is when you're 30, there are good places to work in this building and there's bad places to work. I mean, there's good cultures that actually try to develop you and some that don't. And that's one thing. Another thing Mitch said to me just today is he actually sought out my dad as a mentor. And sometimes young people ask me if I'll be their mentor. And so I think, and perhaps, if for some of you who don't know this, this is my 147th trip to Romania. And one of the things that I admire so much about Romanians is your parents really can't mentor you in the business world that you're growing up in because they grew up in a very different culture. So I would encourage you, because when a young person asks a foreigner to be their mentor, it's an honor. So Mitch taught me this about my dad. He sought out my dad as a mentor. You have to be intentional about it. Two other very short things that I learned from my dad that was true is, number one, trust is the most valuable commodity you'll ever have in business. Neither Mitch or I, if you saw us at 22, you would have thought we were going anywhere.
No way.
Because we weren't impressive. At least I wasn't impressive at anything. But trust is the most valuable commodity you have. It will come back again and again and again. And secondly, how you end things will come back to you again and again and again. If you don't like your job, if you leave on good terms, you accommodate people, it will come back again. I had to fire probably 20 people as a venture capitalist. I don't think I ever fired somebody and it ruined the friendship because you ended it well. So there's two other things from my dad. Trust and how you end things are how very average people like Mitch and I succeed. And you guys are stepping into a new world. I really do think you're finally in a new world in this global digital economy. You're out of the old Romania where business is a zero-sum game. These things that Mitch is talking about, that if my dad were here, you would say, I think are really relevant. So thank you, Mitch, for helping me learn about my dad.
It is so true to just ask. And you have to be willing to be rejected in order to ask. Mm-hmm. But just ask. And if somebody rejects you, it's not because of you. It's because of them. They just don't have time. They have other mentoring relationships. But yeah, so glad I asked some questions of Don's dad. And yeah, that's the easy answer to the question you asked before, which is how do you build a mentoring relationship with somebody? Just ask people. Most people will be so honored to be asked. Yeah.
And my last question, actually, I had it on my backup list, and I saw it in the list here. What has been the book or the author that impacted the most in your career?
Oh, man, choosing one book is like choosing which of my 3 children I love the most. And by the way, it's my daughter. I do.
So you see, it's not hard.
I have three kids, and all three of them know which one is my favorite. It's really embarrassing. But when you only have one daughter, it's easy. You're allowed to say that she's the best. But many books, I'll tell you, I'll just mention a few that come to mind right away. I can't do one, though.
Okay.
One is a book called The Future of Management by Gary Hamel. And in it, he talks about some really, at the time, very radical ideas about how business should be done. But probably the most important thing in there is he talks about the concept of innovation, 4 kinds of innovation: product innovation, operational innovation, management innovation, and strategy innovation. The book is worth reading just for that section all by itself. A second one I'll mention is a book that I read very recently called Thinking in Bets. Thinking in Bets, by a woman named Annie Duke, and she's a poker player. I'm not a poker player. In fact, I'm sort of anti-gambling, but it's a great book because she talks about the best way to learn from your life experience is to focus on the quality of your decisions, not the outcomes. The world tells us outcomes are all that matters. She said, no, that's actually not a very good way to get better. You need to focus on the quality of decisions. So that's number 2. Can I mention one more?
Sure.
One more would be, let's see. One more would be another book I read recently called Rejection Proof by a Chinese guy named Jia Jiang. And has anybody ever heard of Jia Jiang? He does a 100-day rejection challenge. You ever heard of this guy? Yeah, okay, so you guys he's really funny. The book is really funny. You can watch his TED Talk online. It's one of the most watched TED Talks of a few years ago. Super, super entertaining, super funny. But don't let the humor get in the way of just how powerful the substance of what this guy is talking about is. And what I like, the reason why I mentioned this particular book is because of the universality of what is inside of his thoughts. So whether you're a CEO of a company or whether you're a college, just somebody just coming out of university, the concepts in this book, I think, are highly relevant, highly important for all of us as we move through life and the more change we're experiencing in the world, which is, of course, something that people talk about all the time, the more important some of these ideas in his book really is. Rejection Proof.
Well, I will say thank you from my side, Mitch. I want to leave time for Ruben to have some questions on GLS, but it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good to be with you.